Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaskar. You have stepped into a course that is going to change the way that you look at data. Not just how you analyze it, but also how you communicate it. My name is Nivid Desai. I serve as the Program Executive at Writing Studio IIT Gandhinagar. Welcome to Writing for Data Science. This course is at the intersection of analysis and communication. As all of us know, data analysis is not just about coding and models. It is about solving real-world problems. And that is exactly why every single thought that goes into solving those problems needs to be communicated. And not just to one audience, across multiple stakeholders. That is where this course comes in. This course prepares you with the foundations of writing, especially curated for data science. We will discuss audience analysis, critical thinking, logical reasoning, as well as storytelling that is native to data science. So join me on a journey at the intersection of numbers and narratives. I'll see you in class. Namaste, hello and welcome to Writing for Data Science. My name is Nivid Desai and we are on a journey to explore the interesting intersections between numbers and narratives. We have begun exploring critical thinking and logical reasoning in some depth now. In the last class, we looked at inductive and deductive reasoning and many other different nuances in the lines of critical thinking and logical reasoning. Today, I want to go a step further and introduce a new set of terminologies within critical thinking and logical reasoning. I want to talk about sources and claims. And how do we evaluate both of them for how strong they are, how relevant they are, and therefore how effective they are. I want to begin by emphasizing why source and claim evaluation matters in our line of work. In data science, we often work with secondary sources, meaning sources from whom we borrow information. This could be data sets collected by others, not our own. So it is not our own survey, it is not our own measurements, but another person, another group, another agency, another academic has collected this data and we are using that data set for our own research, for our own purposes. These could also include research papers, third-party APIs, industry reports, and user feedback. If you notice, the differentiating factor in this entire list is that none of this is generated by us. If it is something that we have generated ourselves, then that is considered primary source, and everything else from whom we borrow information is considered secondary source. Every insight that you create depends on the quality of the sources and claims that you rely on. Clear, critical evaluation is not just good practice. It protects your analysis from bias, error, and loss of credibility. We have understood that all of these and many more are some grievous consequences of bad data practice. Moreover, your evaluation work shows up in your writing. Clear, careful writing signals that your thinking is disciplined and trustworthy. That is why not taking any source or claim at its face value and evaluating its merits amounts to a huge importance in our practice of critical thinking and logical reasoning in the realm of data science writing. Here's something to reflect on before we move on today. What could happen possibly in terms of consequences if you base your analysis on a flawed or biased source? We have looked at what are the effects of consequences, but let's first meditate on the consequences a little bit. What do you think could happen? List down a few ideas and you will realize how serious is it that we need to evaluate our sources and claims thoroughly. Now, let's begin with some key questions to ask while evaluating our sources. The first key question, of course, is who created it? Credibility depends on the creator of the dataset. Is it a government body, an academic institution, a commercial company, or an anonymous uploader? All of these would carry differing amounts of credibility, differing extents of trustworthiness. For example, a dataset from the census conducted by the government would be highly credible because you can go and check the kind of authority with which the government has conducted the census, and their methodology would also be up for evaluation. Therefore, it is highly credible, not only coming from a place of authority and reliability, but also with a robust methodology. However, if you choose a dataset from a random blog without any methods mentioned, that is questionable. Because not only do you not know whether the blog is trustworthy, you also don't know how the data was collected. So, it's two times the threat of unreliability. So, be extremely careful about who has created the dataset that you're using presently. Here's a little exercise for you. You find a dataset about global happiness scores from a lifestyle blog. Now, I believe by now you would have understood that this is an unreliable source. But what are the two concerns that you might have? You not only have to justify the reliability of your source, you also have to justify the unreliability. Why is it that you are rejecting a certain source? Also matters just as much. So think about it from that perspective. What kind of concerns and questions might arise in your mind when you look at a lifestyle blog talking about global happiness scores? The second question to ask while evaluating sources is how was it collected? In this case, the methodology matters a lot. Was it a random sample? Was it self-reported data? Does it have a small sample size? Is it a controlled experiment? All of these are methods through which data can be collected. I will give you an example. Recently, in data science, statistics, and particularly in its application in economics and finance, the methodology of randomized controlled trials is booming. What we just discussed as the controlled experiment is among the most reliable, considered to be among the most reliable methodologies in research. So, the methodology, if it lays out randomized controlled trial, then that could be one of the reasons for trusting the verifiability and the reliability of the data. Here's an example. A survey of 100,000 users, 1 lakh users from random countries is likely strong because there is no bias, there is a multiplicity of data points, and the sample size is significantly large. But a survey of 20 volunteers from a tech conference is obviously a biased sample. Why? Not only because the sample size is small. Of course, that is a huge concern. Look at 100,000 versus 20. The sample size is obviously too small. But it is also from a tech conference. So it is highly likely that the kind of perspectives that you would arrive at from the tech conference are already skewed in a certain direction. That is why it is a biased sample, unreliable sample, not worth using. Here's a reflection for you. You have a survey of consumer satisfaction with only 50 responses. What questions should you ask before using it? I'm not directly indicating that you should not use it. Look at the data, look at the problem, and ask questions. What questions should you ask before you try to use it for your own purposes? Ask yourself this, and you will arrive at some clarity about further reliability of data. The third question is about timeline. When was it collected? The freshness of the data also matters. How recent, how latest, how updated is the data? Is it outdated to the problem that you are addressing? If it is outdated, it might carry skewed results also. It will start reflecting in your consequences. It will start reflecting in your results. So, as and when it is possible, please prefer updated, latest, and most reliable data sources so that your conclusions, your results, and your recommendations also reflect the changing trends within data. Here's an example. Using COVID-19 data from March 2020 to make predictions in 2024 would be misleading because behaviors and variants of the virus would have changed. This is an example of the freshness, the updated nature of data. Because the situation was changing rapidly, therefore, the data and the recommendations based on data should also update and upgrade rapidly. Shall we reflect on this question before we move forward? Why might outdated data sometimes be dangerous than no data at all? In some cases, you have to necessarily rely on outdated data because the updated version is not available. However, why would that be more dangerous as compared to no data at all? Think about it. Think about the consequences of not using latest data or latest data not being available. Now we arrive at the fourth and the final question in evaluating the sources while looking at data sets. The fourth question is about purpose. Why was it created? Purpose, in fact, affects the bias that is underlying in data. Was the data collected for research? Was it collected for marketing? Was it collected for advocacy? Or for entertainment? If you look at it, all of these are different purposes for collecting data, and all of them may have an underlying bias for it. Something done for research obviously carries a lot more objectivity as compared to something done for entertainment. So, here's an example. A marketing agency's study about social media effectiveness might exaggerate the results to promote its tools. I'm sure you would be thinking about many such advertisements that you would see in newspapers, on social media, and on TV that rely on data, but their sources are not clear. As compared to that, a peer reviewed article usually faces stricter standards of scrutiny. So, if you're relying on a peer reviewed article to carry the data sources further, then that might be your source for better reliability. Because their purpose is purely for research, it is purely for academics. There is no vested interest or no vested funding within collecting that data. So, look for the purpose of gathering the data to come to a conclusion about whether to use it or not. Before we move forward to the next chapter, here's the final reflection within the key questions. Why does knowing the purpose behind the data matter for trusting it? And I would like you to think about all the four aspects that we just discussed: research, marketing, advocacy, and entertainment. Why does it matter that all the four of them may yield different results? Think about this for a second, and we will come back with key techniques for evaluating claims. We have just discussed evaluating sources, and now we will arrive at the second part of today's lecture, evaluating claims. We just discussed the key questions to ask while evaluating our sources. Now, let's arrive at the key techniques of evaluating our claims. Number one, check for logical soundness. Does the claim follow logically from the data that is provided? Or is it stretching the evidence? Is it jumping onto conclusions too quickly from a smaller sample size? For example, the claim can be that our app increases happiness by 40%. The reality may be the survey asked, are you satisfied with the app? But satisfaction is not equal to happiness. Therefore, there is no logical soundness to the claim that our app increases happiness by 40%. It is just a reach. It is just jumping to the conclusion without sound logic in its background. Try to do this exercise. Write a more logically sound version of this claim right here. 80% of users liked the new design, so it cured their stress. Right? This is a tall claim. It is something that is known as a reach. It is jumping to a conclusion that is broader than the scope of data. So, try to write a more logically sound version so that you can carry your claim with as much objectivity as possible. Now we arrive at the second technique of evaluating our claims. Look for missing context. Does the claim leave out any important conditions, caveats, or competing explanations? For example, the claim may say that 90% of users renewed subscriptions after the feature rollout, but the reality may be that only 10% of users were active users to begin with. So, that added context is missing from the claim that is being made. Therefore, it is not a reliable claim. So, you look for missing context within a claim to check whether it is logically sound or not. Have you ever seen a statistic that felt suspiciously too perfect? That is something worth reflecting upon, isn't it? Sometimes a data point or a statistic seems too good to be true. And when it turns out that it was hiding some important information, what was missing? Think about it. If something was too perfect, or if something was too good to be true, what was hidden beneath the layers? And that might give you some idea about how faulty data practice leads to lack of context in the data that you are presenting. And eventually, it'll end up duping your audiences into believing something that is not true. Then we arrive at the third technique, verifying against multiple sources. If both of these conditions are still seeming to be suspicious, you arrive at the third technique to arrive at reliability. Don't trust a single report blindly. Cross-check the key claims with multiple sources whenever it is possible. For example, if one study says video ads outperform banner ads, look at broader marketing research to see if that trend holds elsewhere, so that you don't arrive at a faulty judgment too fast just because the claim seems to be matching with the biased worldview that we often have. So, checking against multiple sources, verifying the claim that is being made, often saves us from the embarrassment of making an obvious mistake. Here's an exercise. You find a claim that says AI will replace 50% of jobs by 2030. What would be two steps that you could take to verify this claim? Think about all the three techniques that we have studied and then arrive at the two steps that you can take to verify the claim AI will replace 50% of jobs by 2030. And after that, we will arrive at the last few remarks of our lecture today. This is not just about writing as a process. I understand that we have been establishing a perspective and a way of temperament within writing for critical thinking and logical reasoning, but don't worry. We also ensure that this kind of practice ends up showing in your actual writing. When you put the words down on paper, it shows that you have evaluated your claims and sources carefully. When you do that, your writing becomes more cautious, as in you show the limitations and you avoid over promising. It becomes more credible. You cite high quality sources and you explain the assumptions that you have made. And then it becomes more ethical, as in you avoid misleading your readers by omission or by exaggeration. You don't leave out any details or you don't bloat up any details to make your readers believe something that may not necessarily be true. Here's an example of weak writing that may not be doing what we just studied. The model is perfect because it was trained on the best available data set. If you think about it, this is doing everything that we just discussed as weaknesses. It is overpromising, it is not talking about limitations, it is not citing any sources, and it is assuming a lot of things. As a result, the reader may be led to believe something that may not possibly be true. So therefore, here's an example of how to turn that lousy claim into something that is strong. While the model achieved high accuracy on this data set, the data was self-reported. That's the limitation right there, introducing potential bias that future validation should address. This right here ensures that the readers are not misled by any dubious information. No important detail is omitted and no irrelevant detail is exaggerated. That is why it is an example of strong writing. Here are some practical habits that we can imbibe to ensure that our evaluation capacities become better. Always read the About This dataset or methodology section within a report, a paper, or any technical document that you read. Then ask, who benefits if I believe this? Is there a vested interest in making me convinced about any of these things? When in doubt while writing, add a small disclaimer. So, for example, based on preliminary results, pending further validation, all of these are disclaimers that signals the audience that this data is still in progress. And then check if the findings align with the broader research, or if they are surprising outliers that demand extra scrutiny. It is not always necessary that your findings will align with broader research. In case if you find that your findings are outliers, it behooves us to make sure that there is extra scrutiny in ensuring that the outliers are justified. Evaluating sources and claims is not a checkbox that you complete once. It is a way of thinking. It teaches you to be skeptical without being cynical, careful without being slow, and precise without being rigid. Ultimately, your writing will reflect your thinking. If your mind is careful and honest, your writing will also be careful and honest. That was it from my end for this lecture. We were looking at evaluating sources and claims for data science. We looked at what sources and claims are, and we looked at different questions and techniques to evaluate where they come from, how reliable they are, and should we use them or not. This is a muscle that will need some practice. I hope that as we spend more and more time becoming critical and logical in our writing, this habit also starts growing with time. In the next lecture, we will look at how to make strong claims from our data science arguments. Until then, keep learning, stay curious, all the best. I will see you in the next class. Thank you so much for joining me today. Namaskar.